Britain's finest unit for forensic investigation, is embarking on a new and groundbreaking mission. Experts in human identification, they use the full arsenal of modern technology. But now, for the first time, they're applying these skills to identify bodies from the long, distant past.
It's very exciting for us to be able to take the skills that we use on a daily basis and apply them to look at historical skeletons to see just how far we can go.
Forensic anthropology, facial reconstruction, and painstaking research will be used to open new windows on history as dramatic personal stories emerge from long forgotten bones.
Historical research is allowing me to investigate people's experiences at different times throughout history.
He certainly had a nasty crack to the top of his head that could well have contributed to his death.
So we've got the face, the facial reconstruction, and we've added some textures.
Fantastic. That is just superb.
The latest case surrounds the heavily scarred skeleton of a woman that has puzzled historians since it was excavated by the Museum of London in 1992.
It's just horrendous. That must have been so painful.
The bones reveal shocking new truths about life on the streets of Victorian London.
That's just an open wound.
That's right.
And the case takes a dark and dramatic turn.
Men, I'm afraid, will find children sexually attractive.
Can they piece together the woman's identity and discover why she was left in an unmarked grave?
This one doesn't add up.
Oh, this is a mystery, isn't it?
The cold case team is heading back to one of the darkest chapters of the 19th century. This is the Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification at Dundee University. Professor Sue Black will carry out the initial observation on this mysterious skeleton with her colleague, Dr. Xanthi Mallet.
We have KCW 1211, excavation site of specimen burial ground located in Borough, central London.
Oh, I know Borough.
Do you?
Yes, I know Borough. I used to cycle round Elephant Castle roundabout.
Okay.
In another life.
At this stage, they have very little information.
Oh, it's very heavy.
But as they lay out the bones, it's clear this skeleton has a story to tell.
Oh, there's lots of interesting things going on in there. Good.
The gender and age quickly become apparent.
Everything about it shouts female.
Gracile as well.
So, in terms of supraorbital ridges,
female.
mastoids,
Yeah.
nuchal lines. You can see just the edge of the epiphysis there. It's not finished growing. So that puts her down into the 20s category quite comfortably.
By measuring the long bones of the leg, they can estimate this young woman's height.
That equals
4'7".
Yeah.
Tiny. Absolutely tiny.
But the most dramatic aspect of her skeleton are the scars visible on almost every bone of her body.
We've got significant evidence of an infective situation,
right.
which is throughout the body, very prominent within the skull. We've even got it on the back of the manubrium. That's it. So it's just following absolute textbook syphilis, the whole thing. Let's look at the thickness of it.
Syphilis was once one of the most feared bacterial diseases in the world. Arriving in Europe around 1490, it once affected up to 15% of the British population.
It's just so heavy because there's been so much bone alteration and deposition. That must have been so painful. Okay, female, young adult, very, very, very short. Very, very, very short with syphilis. She's just a little small young adult. And at the same time, what you've got is superimposed upon this, the horror that would have been syphilis. The fact that not only is her bone being eaten away and the pain associated with that, but the disfigurement that comes with it as well. And the disfigurement that comes with it is a cruel disfigurement because preferentially it wants to go to your face. It's not the kind of face that children would happily look at. It's the kind of face that children would cry at. And that's quite sad for someone who's so very young.
So this is the body of a young woman, probably in her 20s. She was around 4'7" tall and was ravaged by syphilis. To reconstruct the details of her life, the team will need to delve into a murky world of quacks and agonizing treatments for a disease that remained a medical mystery.
Case reference CW.
Sue and Xanthi bring together the rest of the team at the evidence board. Dr. Caroline Wilkinson will carry out the facial reconstruction, while Dr. Wolfram Meyer-Orgenstein will analyse trace minerals in the bones. These will reveal information about her diet, her social status, and where she might have lived and died.
There's an area of, quite an extensive area of alteration on the frontal bone. Yeah. The other area where the changes are most extensive are down at the lower end of the lower limbs. And this is a fairly typical pattern for syphilis, which is quite far advanced. It's not the stage of syphilitic change where the face is eaten away in terms of bone.
There may be a little going on the nasal bones.
On the nose. What those photographs also show is extensive bowing on the legs as well. I think that's probably as a result of rickets. I think we've got a dietary deficiency in there as well.
And then you would say basically somebody from a whatever lower social status.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Presumably the archaeologists will be happy about the dating and the location. You need to go and find out. You need to go and find out any artefacts associated with her, anybody else in that vicinity. Is she on consecrated ground or not?
Yeah.
All of those sorts of things.
Yep.
In terms of hard evidence, all they have is a set of bones, but they're a doorway into the story. And for Sue Black, that's the beauty of the challenge.
She was dealt a fairly mean set of cards. It wasn't a good hand she was given. If you just looked at it as being a skeleton, and nothing more than a skeleton, then you're just not seeing below the surface. And everybody, every single person has got a story. And it's our job to try and find the story. And the more we can personalise that person, the more we can feel we get to know them.
Xanthi's job is to go in search of historical clues about who the woman was and what kind of life she had. The trail will start in London, at the site where her body was discovered. Facial reconstruction expert Caroline Wilkinson often has to deal with badly damaged skulls when trying to rebuild a person's face.
Caroline and I have known each other for a number of years, and I actively sought to take Caroline to Dundee because she has a skill set that I am not aware that anybody else possesses. She is the best at what she does. So that anything that comes into here that involves faces, it's Caroline, because that's her area, and nobody will beat her in that.
But the diseased head of our woman will pose a unique challenge. Before Caroline starts work on the reconstruction, she examines the skull with her colleague Caroline Needham.
What have we got there? We need to know about these nasal bones because there's quite a bit missing. And that would obviously have an effect on what her nose is going to look like. Well, this is an interesting skull because it's clearly got some pathological condition that we need to take into account with the reconstruction. Things like syphilis can affect the shape and form of the soft tissues of the face. So we need to assess the severity of it, how long-standing it will have been, how long the person had it for, so that we can make a best estimate of how that would have affected the features of their face. I always enjoy reconstructions where we've got more of a challenge. And it's nice to be able to show conditions, especially conditions that we might not necessarily see in contemporary population in an archaeological investigation.
With the visual examination complete, laser technology creates a detailed 3D representation of the skull. The laser scan will be used as a base on top of which the complex layers of muscle and tissue can be added. But it will be a few weeks before the unique face of our woman starts to emerge.
We all have the same muscles on our face, but because each skull is a slightly different shape, one skull may be thinner and longer than the other, another may be fatter, and so once you model each of those muscles in place, then you will automatically get a different face shape with different proportions because it's the skull that dictates the muscle structure.
Xanthi arrives in London to learn more about where the skeleton was found and start building a picture of her life.
What this historical research is allowing me to do is to really investigate people's experiences at different times throughout history, because normally I actively don't look into the person's history because your report has to be objective, scientific. There can be no personal influence. I start with the science and it ends with the science because it has to, because it's part of a forensic process.
Tucked away in a back street of Borough near London Bridge is a burial site known as Crossbones. This was the last resting place of the young woman. Xanthi is here to meet Adrienne Miles from the Museum of London, who excavated the body in 1992.
The site was actually underneath this big brick building here, which is an electricity substation that was built as part of the Jubilee Line extension.
So you wanted to excavate the site before that building was actually placed?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we had 6 weeks to do it in total.
6 weeks? What happened to this site after you excavated it? Did you remove all of the remains?
All the remains from underneath the building were removed. The unexcavated areas still have the burial ground.
So this all has...
We are now standing on untouched burial ground, yes. There are several thousand burials beneath our feet.
Us.
There's a theory that it was a single women's burial ground, prostitutes,
Right.
basically. By the period that we're excavating at, it's very much the poor ground for the parish of St Saviour's.
Right.
In that the people who would be buried here would be the poor of the parish, bodies found in the river, people from the workhouse.
So people who couldn't afford
People who couldn't afford to pay for their own burials.
The history of the site immediately suggests this woman came from a very poor background.
All the burials were in coffins, but they're of the poorest standard that I've ever seen.
Really?
You're looking at reused wood. It's probably cheap wood that's coming off the docks. I mean, there's a couple of photos here from the excavation as we were...
Very tightly packed, obviously, aren't they?
Yes, very much so. Not only are they tightly packed horizontally, they're also up to 9 or 10 deep.
Really? So this whole ground basically would have been 8 or 9, 10 deep in coffins. That's basically what you're walking on with some soil over the top?
Yes, and not a lot of soil.
Really? And how far down was the young woman we've been talking about?
Within a metre of the top of the excavation.
So she was a fairly
So
late...
she would have been one of the latest burials that we've dug, yeah.
Is there anything that could help us really pin down a date or at least a time specifically when she might have actually been interred?
The burial ground closes in October 1853.
So we know it was obviously previous.
So it must be pre that.
Yeah.
Given the intensive use of the burial ground and the amount of burials that were going in, you wouldn't have survived in place long.
Yeah.
Maybe as little as 10 or 20 years.
So really from post-1830s, really?
Yes.
1830s to 1853.
Yeah.
The Crossbones woman was clearly not among those benefiting from the burgeoning wealth of the Victorian Empire. At that time, the Borough area of London was a slum, filthy and overcrowded. Having learned that the woman was most likely buried around the mid-19th century, this gives the team a window in which to research historical records. The Victorians are known for keeping detailed population registers, but could the young woman be among the names? Xanthi has come to the London Metropolitan Archive to meet Dr. David Green from King's College London.
We found this young woman. She's in an unmarked grave. I was really hoping you could find a potential name for her. Is that something you think you could do?
It's possible.
Year of death is going to be difficult because it's unmarked, but I've got a time period when I think she may have been buried within.
Yeah, we could look at burial registers.
Yeah.
Each parish kept a burial register.
All right.
We could look at hospital records. There's a couple of hospitals in the locality. There's also a workhouse in the locality, and if she was poor...
Yes, she was, yeah.
Well, she may well have died in the workhouse.
She was very poor, and interestingly, we know that she was suffering from syphilis. I don't know whether she's been treated for that, but certainly she had medical conditions, so that might be a good place as well.
Well, those would be the three places I'd start. Once we've got a set of names, we might even get an age. Let's see what we can find.
Give it a go.
We'll give it a go.
Over the next few weeks, David will look through hundreds of records from the borough area. He will cross-reference the results of the team's forensic investigation with hospital and burial records. It's a long shot, but can he put a name to the skeleton? The context of where and how the skeleton was found points to the woman having come from a very poor background. Now it's up to science to confirm whether her bones back up the historical evidence. In Dundee, Wolfram is carrying out further analysis of the bones.
How's it looking?
He knows what he's talking about. He, to my mind, is the grandfather of all stable isotope analysis. There is nobody else that I would go to. There is nobody else that I would trust in terms of relaying that information for a forensic investigation.
By studying the carbon and nitrogen isotopes within the bones, he can discover details about the person's diet and geographical movement during their lifetime. But in this case, the fact that she was riddled with syphilis has broken down the composition of the bone and is affecting the results.
Just by looking at the bone, you can see the attack that has taken place. A bone, no matter which bone you're looking at in the skeleton, has a pitted appearance. So the chances are that we will not get any meaningful data which would give us an indication about geographical provenance.
Although he won't be able to reveal the woman's geographical movements, Wolfram has been able to uncover vital information about her diet.
The carbon signature was suggesting a diet that's sort of at the lower end, so omnivore, not that much meat in the diet, more vegetables and whatnot.
This means our woman ate very little protein, confirming that hers was not a life of privilege. Xanthes arrived at the Museum of London, one of the world's largest collections of skeletons, holding an extraordinary 17,000 bodies in its vaults. The Crossbones woman was one of 148 skeletons found at the same burial site. A high proportion of them were infants, reflecting the high mortality rate in poor areas of Britain at the time. Xanthe is meeting curator Jelena Bekvalak to see if the bones of the children can shed new light on the early life of the Crossbones woman.
That area particularly wasn't a very nice area at all. I mean, it really was known for being quite a sort of a slum area, bad cases of things like cholera, infection. So not a very good environment at all for being born into and then trying to survive and living. Yeah. So you were doing very well actually to sort of live and survive in that sort of condition.
So is there anything within the actual skeletons that can indicate that they had poor diet, so, you know, a relationship to their lifestyle?
Yeah, there are. Something like rickets is something that we might see in the skeletons. This is a femur, so that's your leg bone. This is on the right-hand side.
How old is this individual?
This individual's probably aged about 1.5 years old. What we were seeing in these children is that we saw a much higher rate of rickets, active rickets, and also things like scurvy as well, which would indicate to us the sort of environment and nutrition that they were getting.
So they're not eating fresh fruit and vegetables,
No,
essentially?
they haven't got a very good diet, no.
Yeah.
You've got pollutants, industrialisation and poor diet. So we're seeing that in the skeletons.
19th century Borough would have been covered in thick smog caused by industrial pollution. And the bending of the bones that characterised rickets was caused by lack of exposure to sunlight as well as a poor diet. Xanthe is starting to build up a compelling profile of our young woman. Her circumstances weren't unique, but if we can reclaim her as an individual, what can we learn about the time she lived in, seen through her eyes?
What's really come out from talking to Jelena is that the people buried in this gravesite and the people living in that area of London at that time really were the poorest of the poor. They were suffering from disease, poor diet. She was only in her early 20s when she died. So really, I mean, she's had quite a sad, desperate existence.
Back in Dundee, Caroline is starting the facial reconstruction.
The first thing that we do is to build up the muscles of the face one by one onto the skull. So we have a database of pre-modelled muscles. We import each one and then alter it to fit the new shape of the skull. Each muscle will give the shape of the face at that point. So the skull dictates the muscle structure and the muscle structure dictates the overall facial appearance. And then we can look at the details of the face, such as some of the features like the nose and the mouth and the eyes and the ears, and position those from looking at the morphology, which is the shape of the bone.
The next stage will be to uncover precisely how the syphilis would have disfigured the woman's face. With the different areas of the investigation having made good progress, the team reassembles at the evidence board.
We think that our young woman died towards the end of use of this particular graveyard because of where she was located. She's quite close to the top, but she was left in situ. The grave wasn't marked, so we don't know who she is exactly when she was buried, but there may be records that may help us indicate who she might have been.
The team now turn their attention to finding out how this young woman caught her disfiguring disease.
We're not talking about congenital syphilis here, are we?
No.
We're talking about sexually transmitted syphilis. Because if this was congenital syphilis, that means, you know, it was passed to her from her mother.
Yep.
Then the effect as the bones and the teeth are growing, they are deformed.
Congenital syphilis shows specific symptoms, the most obvious of which are notches in the teeth. The crossbones woman's, however, tell the story of syphilis caught through sexual contact.
The syphilis comes at a later age. The bones and the teeth are already formed. You're looking at an after effect, if you like. And so with the lesions that you have in the forehead, it's a taking away of bone and a laying down of new bone. It's not a malformed bone, if you like, in terms of its development. And so this has to be sexually transmitted.
I agree with that, yeah.
I think the next thing that we have to do is go back to the clinicians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think you've got to go and speak to them about how long will she have been infected by this to get to this level of a presentation. All of treating her almost like a patient.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think we can quite happily ignore this as congenital syphilis. This has to be sexually transmitted.
Yeah.
Everything points to the fact that we're looking at somebody who's low socioeconomic status. She has a sexually transmitted disease. So it's not painting a wonderful Victorian Christmas card scenario for her. It's the much more gritty, realistic side of where do I find the next meal that will keep me alive.
By the 19th century, syphilis was a plague in London, affecting up to 20% of the population. Known as the Great Scourge, it was the AIDS of the Victorian era. The disfiguring effects of the disease are well documented. Joseph Town was a medical artist at Guy's Hospital in the 19th century. He created hundreds of wax anatomical models of patients showing a range of diseases, including syphilis. Xanthi is meeting Dr. Patrick French, who still treats syphilis in the 21st century.
The remarkable thing about syphilis is that it's a condition which has these very distinct stages. I mean, the first stage, 2 or 3 weeks after having sex with someone who's got syphilis, you develop an ulcer. But this is what it looks like. This is an old kind of a 19th century kind of wax model of a syphilis ulcer of the lip. You know, if you ignore it, it will just get better on its own. And it looks as though it's healed up.
Okay.
But it hasn't.
All right, so they would think that they're healing.
That's
and
right.
not,
And, you know, if you ignore it, it will go away, it will get better. And then a couple of months later, you feel quite sick, you get fever, and the characteristic thing that happens in secondary syphilis is that you develop a rash.
Yeah.
This is a pretty extreme model of a secondary syphilis rash affecting the face, these kind of pustules. Again, it gets better if you leave it untreated. So after about a month or two, it would have got better.
Right,
and of course,
okay.
she'd be living at a time when there are all sorts of illnesses going around.
Absolutely.
And if you had something that didn't get worse and you got better from, you would then just ignore that.
Yeah, of course.
And then a large minority of people, maybe about 40% of people, develop tertiary syphilis. And there are three sorts of tertiary syphilis. There's syphilis affecting the heart, syphilis affecting the brain, which sometimes can take decades to occur. But also, and clearly what she had, was something called Congenital Syphilis, where you get these pretty nasty lumps of dead tissue, of scar tissue, which affect bones and particularly affect skin. And this is someone with who has a gummer, one of these horrible areas of dying tissue affecting the nose.
So this is necrosing tissue right in the centre of her face.
Exactly. The general view is that it's probably reinfection with syphilis that causes stomata.
So
no one really knows for certain, but that's the likely cause.
And in the minds of moralising Victorians, repeated infection of syphilis could mean only one thing.
STDs, including syphilis, were strongly associated with prostitution at that time.
Thinking about what Patrick said about the fact that it's sexually transmitted and how this was associated largely, rightly or wrongly, with prostitution. So, I mean, I think that's quite a dark line to travel down, but I think certainly there's some indications that this young woman could have caught it as a result of being a prostitute.
Now the team has more information about how the disease would have affected the woman's face. Caroline can start adding the scarring to facial reconstruction.
I'm now trying to add the disease process, the syphilis, so that we can see the lesions. And I can make the skin layer transparent so that I can see the bone beneath, and I can use the lesions on the bone to tell me where the lesions on the soft tissue will be. So I've just been positioning lumps of clay over the surface of the skin, coming through the skin, that are related to the lesions on the bone. And then we can go in and, once we've got the position correct, we can alter the details so that we can see more of these type of lesions and more of the destruction of the soft tissues.
Slowly, she's coming back to life. The pomp and prosperity of the Victorian era masked a dark side of poverty and prostitution. Unless you were born or married into wealth, 19th century London could be a harsh place for a woman. Sadly, with few employment options and barely any state support, it was all too easy for a single woman to fall on hard times. Many found themselves trying to gain entry to the Refuge of the Destitute. Founded in 1806, it was a charitable alternative to prison for petty criminals who the authorities thought could still be reformed. Xanthia's come to the Hackney Archives in London. She's here to look at the details of people who applied for entry into the Refuge of the Destitute. The entries reveal just how many young women turned to prostitution.
It's number 68, narrative of Mary Harris, 18 years of age, of Bath. Her father and mother died when she was very young. About 3 months since, she was enticed from the service of a Mr. Levy, Westcott Street, Bath, by a gentleman's footman and brought to London. He forsook her a week after the trial in town, and as she has been a prostitute in the house to which he brought her till about 1814. I read the petition of Sarah Wade, 18 years of age, of St Saviour's Parish, Borough. Before she became a prostitute, she lived a servant with a Mrs. Beaumont, a foreign lady, upon whose leaving England the petitioner was left destitute, when she was seduced by some young women who persuaded her that she might earn more money by prostitution. On account of disagreement, she left her father and has since been a prostitute. All of these women, even though they're only young, they're only 17, 18 years of age, are really at the stage of desperation where they need somebody to help them. I mean, this is, their last hope.
But if that last hope of refuge failed them, then prostitution was often the only option. It's very plausible the Crossbones woman too survived by these means. Xanthi has discovered that the burial ground where her body was found had a long association with the profession. In the medieval period, the area around the burial ground was owned by the Bishop of Winchester. He licensed prostitutes who became known as Winchester geese. When they died, they were buried at Crossbones. To this day, people tie names of so-called single women known to have been buried in the area to the gates. It has become a shrine to their memory. By the 19th century, prostitution was a major industry in Victorian Britain, bringing in over £20 million a year. London was known as the whore shop of the world. It's been estimated that a fifth of the female population of London were involved in the profession. Although disapproved of by some, prostitution was not illegal. Xanthi is meeting historian Hallie Rubenhold to find out what life was like for the Victorian prostitute.
Women's work is so poorly paid, you can never support yourself and maybe your 6 children. And so you find yourself in a situation where you quite literally have to exchange sexual favours for food in many cases, and that's what a lot of these women were forced into. Prostitution was rife, and especially in the slums, and Borough actually was one of the worst slums in all of London.
What dangers would have been involved for her? She was doing this on a daily basis.
Well, obviously there were tremendous dangers involved in a life of prostitution, disease being the foremost among them. People didn't use prophylactics in the same way that we would use them today, and those that they did use, the condoms, tended to be reusable and weren't always the cleanest things. You would wash it and reuse it, and they weren't always the most effective things either.
So taking what we know about the woman where she was buried, a particular female we've been looking at, we know from the skeleton that she had syphilis. Was that a common problem for prostitutes?
It most certainly was, and actually the lowest prostitutes were generally those who had contracted syphilis and they were on the way out.
So she would have been in that very possibly lowest class of prostitutes.
Yes. It's where prostitute meets beggar, basically. So really destitute, and these are the people who generally were found dead the next morning in the alleyways, having frozen or starved or died of whatever illness they were suffering from.
Sadly, the evidence for our young woman having been one of these lower-class prostitutes is growing. She was ravaged with syphilis, presumably through repeated sexual contact, and her body was discovered in a burial ground with a long association with prostitutes. But what can the woman herself tell the team? Sue is putting the skeleton through a very 21st century examination to see inside the bones. This CT scanner can create a three-dimensional X-ray image of the skeleton. This allows Sue to look for signs of trauma or illness not visible to the naked eye. And the data has revealed some information that will take the investigation in a new and horrifying direction.
We'd felt that by looking at everything that we could find on the skeleton, she was probably into her 20s. The X-rays tell us something very, very different. If you can see, there's a very well-defined line passes across there, and there's another one that passes across there. And that tells us that that growth, that fusion that's happened there, wasn't that long ago. So I think in terms of putting her into her 20s, I'm afraid we were making her a little bit older than she probably was. I think it's more likely that she was a late teenager, so that she may have been 17, 18, perhaps even 19 years of age. So in some ways it's really even sadder that what we're looking at is a teenager racked with the amount of disease that we could see apparent on her skeleton. And she's actually a whole lot younger than we thought.
It means that if she was suffering from advanced tertiary syphilis, which often takes years to develop, that she was probably infected as a child. Sue calls the team back to the evidence board to discuss the disturbing discovery that this isn't the body of a woman in her 20s.
We didn't expect to see anything terribly interesting in the CT scans. We thought we might pick up some Harris lines and other things. But what we did pick up is something that's likely to change what we thought was the original age for the young lady. So I think we need to bring her down into a teenager. Ooh. Is the truth. So if you think that we're looking at a teenager, maybe even 15 or 16 years of age, and you're saying that the level of disturbance that we're seeing physically in relation to her could be anything that's 3 to 10 years in the making, then you take 3 years off that, you're in 13.
Don't take 10 off.
10 years of that.
No,
you're on
don't
6.
do
Why not
that.
take 10 years off it? Have you any idea on a daily basis how many cases we work on paedophiles? So that, you know, men, I'm afraid, will find children and teenagers sexually attractive. What's really tragic is you're talking about a first infection that was certainly at a very young, just even possibly even pre-teen, but early teens.
With the age of consent at 13 years old, girls were sexualised at a young age in Victorian Britain. It was also wrongly believed that sleeping with a virgin could cure a man of syphilis. In the absence of medical knowledge about syphilis, quackery and superstition often took hold.
So for the Victorians, the syphilis that seemed to go away and then came back and seemed to go away and came back must have been a really difficult thing to try to manage. When you have this lack of knowledge and lack of understanding of why something occurs, how it progresses, how to stop it, you are in many ways open to the quacks. There will be an entire raft of treatments that will have no effect whatsoever, and there will be those that just become myth. For people who can't even afford those remedies, what else could I try that might try to save me? It's a desperation element. But if you're desperate, you'll try almost anything.
Xanthia's returned to London to discover how the Victorians tried to cope with a disease that was so little understood. At the Science Museum, she's meeting Julie Peakman, who has researched Victorian treatments for syphilis.
So what we've got here are some of the treatment bottles.
That looks like a lotion or a cream which might have been applied to the skin.
Right.
And there are also treatments which can be ingested.
So this is a mercury-based treatment. Now, I'm looking at this vial here and it says mercurial cream, poison. So this is obviously a very poisonous treatment.
It was a poison, but mercury was thought to be the best cure for syphilis.
Mercury was believed to help expel syphilis from the body, but the hideous side effects were well known, as illustrated in this Victorian cartoon.
On the left-hand side here, we have a man who's purging and being sick into the bowl, and that was one of the symptoms of mercury because it was a poison.
Yeah.
Spitting and salivation was very important. One of the effects was balding. As you can see, this man in the chair here having his head attended to by one of the hospital interns.
Would you lose your hair in patches or would you lose it all over?
It'd drop off rather like with chemotherapy now. As the toxin starts to work, it would start to fall out.
So, because I think you'd lose patches through the syphilitic change, wouldn't you? Because you've got the pustules on your head, but then the mercury would cause you
just
to
about
lose
finish you off, yes.
all your hair. All right, OK.
And as you can see to the right here, this man's having his teeth seen to, and that was another problem, that the teeth fell out.
Not only did the mercury do nasty things to you, it was also expensive. So if you were poor and suffering from syphilis in Victorian London, you had little choice but to throw yourself on the mercy of charitable hospitals, some of which had wards for the condition. Only one, the Lock Hospital, was dedicated to treating venereal disease, but getting in was no easy matter.
She would have had to plead her case to access that hospital.
She would. You had to go through the governors to be accepted, and they would have had to vet her and see her as a person that they would have wanted to support.
But even if our woman had managed to gain access to mercury treatment, would it have had any positive effect? Xanthi is meeting chemical engineer Hal Sosabowski to recreate a Victorian mercury treatment.
We're going to start making an ointment now, an old-fashioned anti-syphilitic ointment, using a recipe from this pharmacopoeia, British pharmacopoeia. This is the 1869 version. This is unguentum hydrargyrum subchloride. That's the ointment of liquid silver, the subchloride thereof.
There's only got 2 ingredients.
It has. It's got the active ingredient, which is the mercury chloride, and the lard, which is the dispersant.
Yeah.
This is mercury 2 chloride. This used to be called corrosive sublimate. And the reason this is so toxic is it's got mercury ions in it rather than elemental mercury. And mercury ions are A, very soluble in water, and B, are just the right form to do damage to cells by damaging the enzymes. And you just need to make sure we don't breathe any of this in, because this really is hideously toxic. Not healthy at all. So as you can see, there's the 2 parts of the ointment. So this would be sort of what you'd be given by the apothecary, the chemist of the day, the pharmacist, and that would be spread on the pustules.
So if I rub this onto my skin regularly as a treatment, what would the effects be?
Well, you couldn't have designed a better way of getting mercury into the body in its worst possible form. And what would happen is the patient would be absorbing mercury into the bloodstream effectively, and therefore they would get the bleeding gums, the irritability, the amnesia, perhaps the depression, all associated with mercury poisoning.
So this is a really bad idea?
Incredibly bad.
OK. If we were in Victorian England now, this would be one of the treatment for syphilis then. But did mercury have any medicinal value at all?
Well, there was some evidence in stage 3 syphilis. It was spiricidal, i.e. it would kill the bacterium that causes syphilis. By that point, you'd certainly reached the point of no return.
Right.
And because there was no penicillin at that time, once you got it, you got it. So all it did was slow down. There's no cure for syphilis. Right, so there we are.
Nice.
Although mercury couldn't cure advanced syphilis, it could have given the sufferer like our woman some relief.
It may seem ridiculous that people would have inhaled mercury or rubbed it on their lesions or taken it as a pill, but it could be argued that we use treatments that are equally as damaging now. If you think of chemotherapy, we know it has beneficial effects, obviously, but the harmful effects are clear to see.
But this has highlighted another unknown aspect of this case. Xanthi still doesn't know whether or not our woman ever received any medical treatment for a disease that she clearly lived with for some time. Archaeologist Fiona Tucker might have the answer. Fiona has been analysing skeletons from the Victorian era for traces of the mercury treatment. One of the skeletons in her study is the Crossbones woman, and the amount of mercury in our woman's bones is significant.
In your opinion, did she show signs of having mercury treatment and poisoning in her skeleton?
On the ICP-MS test, which measures the elemental makeup of her bones, we found 7.33 parts per million of mercury, which is substantially higher than both modern levels, where you expect about 0.05 parts per million, because we don't come into contact with mercury much in everyday life anymore, and other individuals from her period who I looked at who had 1 to 1.5 parts per million, which I think in an age where mercury was much more prevalent would be a reasonable amount to find. Her raised level suggests she came into contact with a lot more mercury during her life.
Is there anything here that indicates that she was having mercury treatment from the actual bones?
The thing it seems to have affected most often is the teeth. That's something we have from historical sources, that mercury weakens teeth and can make them fall out. And she does have particularly poor teeth for her age in terms of tooth loss and dental care. But I think this girl had it a long time and it was very serious, but she was living with it. The pattern of healing suggests that she was living with it for a long time, and I think it's unlikely that it killed her.
Despite her poor background and advanced stage of syphilis, it appears our woman did manage to access mercury treatment. Her bones also show signs of healing.
I've got a slightly more optimistic impression of the kind of society in which our young woman would have been living in. I mean, she had syphilis, it is a debilitating disease, but she had managed to access some treatment. Obviously, there was no cure, but certainly I'm fairly sure now that she didn't die of syphilis.
Even if the syphilis did not kill her, it was still disfiguring. Back in Dundee, Caroline is almost ready to reveal the woman's face.
What we have now is the surface shape of the lesions as well as her face shape. What we need to do now is to take those lesions and add texture to them so that some of them will become transparent, so they'll be fluid filled. Some of them will be more hard and scar-like, and that's where the texture comes in. It gives it a more realistic surface. So she's going to look less like her face is made of porridge, which is what it looks like now, and more like she's got syphilitic lesions. Well, we can take this reconstruction that we have with the syphilis and we can try and depict her as she would have looked without this severe disease. Part of it will involve some degree of estimation because some of her nasal bones have been disrupted through the disease process. So we'll have to estimate the nose, but we should be able to get enough of a likeness of her as she would have looked without the syphilis, which would be nice to see as well, especially as she had this mercury treatment.
Xanthi has one last crucial job to do in London, at the Metropolitan Archive. For the last few weeks, Dr. David Green has been going through 19th century records for the area around Crossbones Cemetery. He's been cross-referencing burial records and hospital records, trying to find the names of people with similar stories to the Crossbones woman. David has focused his research on the last 3 years of the Crossbones Cemetery, from 1851 to 1853, because the skeleton was found near the surface.
If we go to the burial registers, we've done it for about 3 years or so, we can narrow it down because that age group it was quite rare for someone of that age group to die.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, I mean, you know, you either died young or you died old, but actually, in the middle, there's relatively few people.
David has narrowed down his research to a few names, but one of them stands out.
So here we have the dead book.
Yeah.
The burial registers of St Thomas's Hospital in Southwark. It's a charity hospital. It takes a lot of poor patients.
Right.
And if she died in a hospital, then it may be that she's in here.
Oh, okay.
We went and looked at the ages of people who died, and here we have this woman called Elizabeth Mitchell. She's
19.
age 19. The date she was admitted, 5th of August of 1851. The date that she died, 15th of August. She only lasted 10 days there. This woman, there's something about her, because she comes from, or she's in the hospital in Magdalen Ward. That was a ward for women with venereal disease.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. Okay.
So, and on the right-hand side is a column marked medical remarks, cause of death.
Oh, right.
These are scrawled in, so doctor's handwriting doesn't change.
Typical doctor's handwriting. Yeah, absolutely.
But it looks like it says, ask the physician. Came in for discharge and sores, died under physician's care, and it looks like that then says, with pneumonia.
Elizabeth Mitchell fits the profile of the skeleton. Aged 19, she came to St Thomas's syphilis ward for treatment of sores and discharge, but died on the 15th of August 1851 of pneumonia. Next, David looks at the burial records of the parish of St Saviour's, where the Crossbones Cemetery was located.
Well, here we are in August of 1851. We know that she died in August 1851, and there she is.
Yeah, number 2090. St Thomas's, as you said, 22nd of August, 1851, 19 years. Is that Mr Day is the minister?
Mr Day, the minister, buried her. So she went from the hospital and was buried by the parish. Her abode was St Thomas's Hospital, so they didn't know where she lived.
Oh, right, OK. I don't know why, but for some reason, I kind of got a feeling about this woman.
I think she's a possibility.
Oh, that's quite exciting.
That's exciting. Not for her, but for us.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, historically, it's quite exciting.
Historically, exactly.
Xanthi heads back to Dundee. The investigation of the Crossbones woman is nearing its end. When it began, all the team had was an unknown skeleton from a burial ground in Borough. But a combination of historical and forensic analysis of the bones has brought the case to its conclusion. The team gather for the last time at the evidence board. Caroline is ready to reveal the face of the woman. But first, Xanthi reveals the name and profile she discovered.
So the name that came up was Elizabeth Mitchell.
And she was 19. So kind of at the top end.
At the top end of what? 19's not an issue. It's at the top end of a possibility.
She was admitted to Magdalen ward, which is known as the foul ward. So anywhere where the venereal disease
Known as the what?
Foul ward. In St Thomas's Hospital, which is why we have records that...
I know it very well. I used to work there.
OK. In the records from the hospital, it says she died of pneumonia on the 15th of August, 1851.
Okay.
So a secondary...
Oh, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
The records show that she was later buried in the parish of St Saviour's, which is where the Crossbones graveyard is.
OK.
Got some documentary evidence of somebody like this girl who may have had similar treatment in this period of time in this area. Which is quite nice.
So you obviously will never know, but this does fit with her. She is in the right ward, she's the right kind of age.
Excellent, well done.
I was really impressed.
Well done.
With the historical research complete, it's now time for Caroline to reveal the final piece of evidence.
We've done two here. So first of all, we've got the reconstruction that's done with the disease, so showing the signs of syphilis.
Ooh. The face shows how the young woman would have been horribly disfigured by sores associated with the disease.
So the position of these lesions is based on the position on the skull that you can see. There was some destruction to her nasal bones at the top, but not at the base of the aperture. So we've got a loss of shape of the nose a little bit here with these lesions, but you can still see the overall structure.
So that is pretty horrendous, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's quite extensive, isn't it? It covers quite a lot of the surface of her face. Some of them are fluid-filled, and I'm guessing if she's getting discharged.
OK. Presumably there's a bad smell element to this as well.
Well, I would have thought so. This is an infection.
At the end of the day, you can't hide any form of a disfigurement, really, that occurs on face. There's no escaping your portrayal to the world that you're carrying this disease. No.
Yeah. So it would have been quite obvious that she was suffering. Then what we decided we were going to do was to try and depict her without the syphilis.
OK.
Because it would be useful for us, I think, in terms of seeing her as an individual, to see her her facial appearance without this awful disease which had such an effect on her physical appearance.
And if she'd had access to penicillin and such things, she could technically have been cured from it.
Or never been affected.
Absolutely.
Affected in the first place.
We had to obviously estimate some areas, so the nose, for example, because we've lost some of the nasal bones, is an estimation. But certainly her facial proportions will be accurate, and the details of the mouth is the same as with
a pretty face. I know you don't seem to think so.
Yeah, I think she's quite pretty.
I think that's quite a
Do
pretty
you?
face.
See, I was a little bit disappointed by her.
Oh, it's a good male perspective.
Sort of, yeah, I think the kind as well would probably be sort of homely.
Homely.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah.
So it might be Elizabeth Mitchell.
You never
It
know.
could be.
Age 90.
Know what she looked like.
So I think if we bring this one to a close, because I think we are as far as we can go, the summary on this seems to be that we have a teenage female, probably working as a prostitute, certainly suffering from sexually transmitted syphilis, who did receive treatment for it, because we know that there's mercury within her bone. We suspect that she may have ended up, like many would have done, in a poor hospital, receiving some treatment, and like so many, she may have succumbed to a secondary condition, presumably as a result of her own decreased immune system. Pneumonia would be a very common one, and as a result, she's buried effectively in a pauper's grave. It's very sad, really, isn't it? I have to say.
We kind of knew this was never going to be a happy tale, though.
Well, no, it was, from the outset.
Skeleton,
but I think this has gone as far as it can, and I think it's produced an amazing amount of information, really, that we hadn't anticipated.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a job well done.
Who would have thought we got to a name?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sue and the team have been on an extraordinary journey to piece together the identity of a girl who died more than 150 years ago.
I think the first impression that we had of the crossbones lady was just how small she was. And we had no understanding of the enormity and the strength of the story that was going to eventually materialise from this investigation. Being able to go back in history and using science as the tool to take you back in that history, and still working at the lowest, almost the lowest level of the sector of society, to still come out with a possible name. That's astounding. That really is astounding. That's not something we could ever have predicted as a possibility.
Elizabeth Mitchell was one of thousands of people buried around Crossbones. In its time, it was a pauper's burial ground, but now it's become a shrine. One night a month, a group of volunteers assemble to remember and pay tribute to the dead.
We gather here to remember the outcast dead, the paupers and the prostitutes who were buried here.
People like the woman discovered at Crossbones led a life cursed by poverty and disease. And her story would have stayed buried forever if it weren't for the efforts of the cold case team willing to dig up the truth and disinter history along with the bones.